Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Make sure that you like, share, subscribe if you enjoy our content, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. I'm your host, Nick Belsky, joined as always by Nick Horwat, and we have a great show for you guys today. We're going to lead things off discussing whether one Penguins forward can finally pass a major milestone in his personal career. Secondly, we'll discuss Sidney Crosby because he just continues to laugh in the face of Father Time, and we'll close things out with a listener question that sets up an electrifying top six in the 2025-26 season. Let's get started on the Tip of the Ice-Burgh. And let's kick things off with one of my favorite players, one of your favorite players, Horwat, one of everybody's favorite players, and that is Bryan Rust. He had himself a fantastic game on Sunday against the Florida Panthers. 2 goals, 1 assist, bringing him up to 25 total goals on the season. And it's this time of year, it's this type of conversation that we always have with Bryan Rust. Will he finally be able to reach that elusive 30-goal mark for the first time in his 11-year career?
It's gonna be the race. This is the race for the Penguins. Whereas we know Sidney Crosby is likely going to get his 2 points, knock out that point per game pace thing. We'll get to that in a little bit. As for Bryan Rust, Penguins have 10 games left.
Yep,
10 games left. Going a half a goal a game. I like the chances of it, especially if it's one of those situations where the team is kind of aware of it and are trying to get him a little extra push, much like the Capitals with Evgeni the last couple of years. I get it's not to that same level, but for a fan favorite player, for a team favorite player, just getting him to this little milestone here. I mean, he's also 3 away from 200 in his career, so they're at least going to be shooting for that before the season ends. Who knows? Maybe he pokes in a couple of more post that for his first 30-goal season. I'd say he does it. I just want to try and breed a little bit of confidence into the end of this Penguin season because, I've harped on this team quite a bit this whole year. I've said, what do they have to lose on numerous occasions? I've said this team is pretty much dead in the water quite a few times. So why not for the end of the season here? A little bit of confidence, a little bit of joy, and a little bit of, fun for the end of the season. And absolutely it belongs to Bryan Rust, who, again, dealing with injuries this season, is about to play in his 62nd game, which is as many as he played last year. So he's a bit behind pace, but with nothing much left to lose, why not go for it?
Yeah, now he has been kind of the champ without the belt, per se, when it comes to 30-goal seasons. There have been a couple of years where, if you look at his pace, he's paced out to score more than 30 goals. He's played at a level of a 30-goal scorer. He's just never actually achieved it because, well, sometimes he misses games. Like this year, he's missed 11. 2 years ago, was it 2 years ago? No, last year, he missed 20. And when you miss 20 games and finish with 28 goals, you look at it and you say, well, when you were playing as a 30-goal scorer. You just weren't able to get to that mark. And that's something that, when time passes, a lot of people will always look back and say, oh, how many 30-goal seasons did he have? Well, how many 40-goal seasons did he have? Bryan Rust technically has 0, but I think anybody who pays close enough attention knows that this guy has the talent of a 30-goal scorer. He is an elite goal scorer, and maybe not elite because we toss that around a little bit too much, but he is a very good goal scorer in the National Hockey League and has been for the past half a decade. Now, you mentioned he's 5 away with 10 games left. Coincidentally, he has 5 in his last 10 games played. So he just has to replicate that over the last 10 games. And the thing that I'm looking at here, to take it a little bit too far, to galaxy brain this a little bit, because Horwat, that's what we do on this podcast, right? We always galaxy brain things. 3 of the top 5 teams in Bryan Rust's goal scoring list. So he has a lot of goals scored in his NHL career, but 3 of the top 5 teams who he scored the most on, the Penguins play in the last 3 games of the season. So if it comes down to 1 or 2 goals, history tells us he has a pretty good shot of scoring against the Boston Bruins because he's done it 9 times in his career. He has a pretty good shot of scoring against the Washington Capitals because he's done it 13 times in his career. And he has a pretty good shot of scoring a goal against the New Jersey Devils because he's done that 17 times in his NHL career. So you know what? You're backing him. I'm backing him. This is a reason to tune in the last 10 games. There are multiple reasons to tune in. We'll get to Sidney Crosby here, like you mentioned, in a bit. But this is a big one for me because the last 3 years, one of my bold predictions was Bryan Rust is finally going to do it. He's finally going to reach the 30-goal mark. This year, I kind of said it as a last one, as a bonus one, because I said it's not bold to say it for 3 straight seasons. But, I will be happy if he eventually reaches that 30-goal mark, something that is very deserving for a very big piece of the Penguins organization over the past decade.
Absolutely. Even if you go back through the years, I could list off each one if you really wanted me to. Only one season before the 1920 season. Those ones don't really count. But since then, only one season did he pretty much play at under a 30-goal pace. And that was 22-23. He played 81 and scored 20. Everyone admits, even him, that was an off year. That was just a down year for him. But if you look into the season before that, even 21-22, 24 goals in 60 games. Well, that sounds like he'd be reaching it if he was healthy. In the shortened 2020-21 season, in 56 games, 22. Again, who knows how that pulls through in a full 82-game season where you're not only playing the same 6 teams.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole different weird situation. And in the COVID shortened, the team, like the season was going along and ended thanks to COVID-19, 55 games, 27 goals.
Yeah.
He would have hit 30 before March that year.
He might have hit 40 that season.
Yeah. And because that team was rolling at the time that the season.
Well,
so
I would say rolling, except for they had that West Coast road trip right before, and they lost like every game, including getting blown out to the Sharks. But we don't need to go back down that rabbit hole.
If I'm remembering correctly, though, the last game or two they had before the shutdown, they did well. In fact, I think Bryan Rust had like a 2-goal game against the Devils. Anyway, I
just never remember winning hockey with Patrick Marleau on this roster.
I forgot Patrick Marleau was on this roster. Heck. I mean, yeah, if you look at those numbers, though, you could argue he's been deserving of a 30-goal season since pre-COVID, essentially. And it's getting to that point where he needs to cross that line because, yeah, he is a great goal scorer. He's 32. At some point, that skill will deteriorate a little. I know people say you always have your shot. Yeah, but the team around him is not going to stay very well or stay very good. Who knows if he even stays around? Again, conversations that we'll get into. So it'll be interesting to see. It'll be exciting to watch. And like I said, just with this season essentially being much of nothing for the Penguins, I saw the Rob Rossi tweet about how them winning is kind of ruining it. He's right, but that's a conversation for another day. For this very moment, we would like to see Bryan Rust hit 30 because it's a well-deserving honor for him.
Now, if he does, he will also set a new career high in points at 59. So another sneaky good season for Bryan Rust all around, not just as a goal scorer, but also as a facilitator this season as well, putting up massive numbers on that line with Sidney Crosby and Rickard Rakell. He's kind of faded to the back a bit because those two have been, as we'll talk about with Crosby in a minute, ridiculous. And as we've talked about with Rickard Rakell all season long, absolutely ridiculous. But Bryan Rust, let's not forget that he has been very good and a very integral part of that line's success as well. So hopefully he gets there. If he does, it's career highs on career highs, and Bryan Rust gets a nice feather in the cap heading into the 2025 offseason. Let's discuss Sidney Crosby because we can't go an entire week without talking about him doing something ridiculous or just being ridiculous. He has been absolutely dominant in the calendar year of 2025. Since January 1st, he has 37 points in 30 games. 15 of those 37 points are goals, which means he is on a 40-goal pace, 101 point pace in the last 3 months. Tack on 4 Nations gold, tack on a classic performance against Team Sweden in the opener of that 4 Nations face-off, and you look at it and you say, well, Sidney Crosby does not care about Father Time. He has turned him away at the door more than once, and he is absolutely miles ahead at this stage of his career. Now, entering the final 3 weeks of the season, and you wrote a story about this yesterday, Horwat, Sidney Crosby is tied for first with Leon Draisaitl in 5-on-5 scoring, not since January 1st, not in the last couple of weeks. In the entire season, Sidney Crosby is tops at 37 years old in the National Hockey League at 5-on-5 scoring. 51 points. at not even strength, because that takes away, even strength takes away or takes into account 3-on-3 overtime. It takes into account 4-on-4 situations. But at 5-on-5, he is tops in the league. And as you mentioned, 2 points away from breaking Wayne Gretzky's record for point per game seasons. Might get it tonight against Tampa Bay. So if you're watching this tomorrow, he might have already done it. So we might be talking into the future about something that he's already accomplished. The question that I have for you, Horwat, is with all of these ridiculous facts and figures about 87, should he receive consideration for the Hart Trophy this year?
This year, no. I get the idea of having those conversations the last couple of years, because that was back when the Penguins were still really truly fighting for playoff positioning, still trying to be in that run. And award voters very much like to know if a team is making the playoffs before they consider those sort of players for especially the MVP. It hasn't happened in a very long time that an MVP, that a Hart Trophy winner hasn't made the playoffs. Like I said, the last few seasons it made sense, and I get the idea of the definition of it, of the most valuable to his team, and that no doubt is Sidney Crosby. Those numbers speak for themselves. The age is a non-factor to him. It's and he's been in that 5-on-5 race, that leading in 5-on-5 race for the last few years as well. But this time around, there's just too many monsters in the league. Like Nathan McKinnon could win it again. Connor Hellebuck absolutely deserves consideration as a goalie. And you can never doubt guys like Leon Draisaitl and Connor McDavid. So it would be an interesting topic of conversation for Sid, but just not this season again. It's just a little tougher. The numbers aren't there as much as everyone would like them to be, and the team isn't there. And that's a big piece of it that everyone does take into consideration for that award.
Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but sneaky name in consideration for the Hart this year, keep an eye on Jack Eichel. That Vegas team is not as stacked as it once was. Let's also not forget that guys like William Karlsson, guys like Alex Pietrangelo, guys like Shea Theodore have all missed kind of considerable amounts of time. And Eichel is just, floating in the top 10 and scoring, doing all those things, being great. But I digress on that point. When you look at the Penguins, I mean, not only is there so many other options when it comes to the Hart Trophy this year, because the league has been as parodied as it can be, as parodied as we've seen it in recent memory. All the facts and figures we mentioned about Crosby, the Penguins are still 14th in the Eastern Conference. They're still, even since January 1st, when he's scoring at a 40-goal pace and when he's scoring at a 101-point pace, which is ridiculous in and of itself. Let's not forget, the best season ever at the age of 37 is 100 points. Crosby's at a 101-point pace in the last 3 months. If he would have kicked it into high gear a little bit earlier, this could be another notch in the belt of Sidney Crosby if he could get to that. He's probably not going to get to that. He would need 22 points in the last 10 games, which would be a ridiculous run for a team that has nowhere near a chance of sniffing a playoff spot. But since January 1st, that run, the Penguins are still 27th in points since then. So while, yes, he's probably the most valuable player to his team, that's not how this trophy is voted upon by the NHL media. Will he receive some fifth place votes? Almost guaranteed. He always receives votes, but it's not going to be enough to make him a finalist, and it's certainly not enough to put him over the top as the winner of the 2025 Hart Trophy. Now, here's the thing. Because of how bad the team is around him and how good he's been playing, it makes me understand more the entire conversation being had by mainly Canadian reporters, but the league as a whole about, man, get Sidney Crosby out of Pittsburgh because he is having this historic season on a team that is extremely bad. It's the second worst team that he's ever been on outside of his rookie season. But the one thing I'll say about that, while I do understand on the outside looking in, hey, man, it'd be great if Crosby was playing on literally a team that had any more hope to make the playoffs. Let's not forget to take into account what the player himself wants. Stop saying that he's a prisoner in Pittsburgh whenever he wants to be in Pittsburgh. No matter if they're winning or not, there's a reason he signed a 2-year extension. He knew the writing was on the wall, that they weren't going to be good this year. He knew that it's likely they're probably not going to be that good next year. And he still signed a 2-year contract anyway. So I understand the conversation. I understand the urge, the need to say, man, we want to see this player in the playoffs, because I do too. But let's not forget to take into account that the player himself has said on multiple occasions, pretty much every single month, because he's asked every single month, that he wants to remain in Pittsburgh for his entire career. And until that changes, this conversation is a moot point.
Absolutely. I get it. Like you said, I do get it. I do want to also see Sidney Crosby and Nate McKinnon play on the same team together. I'd like to see it in Pittsburgh. You see the difference there? It's because we want to see our favorite teams, no matter how involved into the sports media, into the national media, whatever it may be, however involved we are, we want our favorite teams to have the best players.
Mm-hmm.
Penguins already have Crosby. Like I said, it would be awesome to see him play with guys like Nathan McKinnon, Cale Makar. Screw it, throw Connor McDavid in there. Essentially, the Team Canada line up that roster, that power play. Sure, I would like to see that too. I'd like to see it in Pittsburgh, though, because A, that's where I'm from. That's the team I grew up rooting for. And C, that team's got a bit more history than at least the Avalanche. The Oilers.
I was about to say, be careful with the Oilers.
That's a bit of a different question. But everyone wants. I do get it. Everyone wants to see Sid succeed. Everyone wants to see him continue to compete, especially because he is putting up these great numbers at this age with a team that can't help him. I get it. I do. But guess what? It's not that he's running the asylum here, but he's not a prisoner in this asylum here.
No.
He is a piece of it, and he's fine being here. He wants to be here. This is where he wants to stay. It's where he'll be for the rest of his career, and most likely post-career after some well-deserved time off. But yeah, I like you said, I get the conversation. I get the questioning, and sometimes it can be fun conversation. It can be. You just have to do it the right way, and a lot of times the Canadian media does not handle it the right way.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of people, and we won't call them out by name, that just are serious about having those discussions, and it's not a serious discussion whenever the player doesn't want to go. And now there are other people that like to throw out some bait, and they do a really good job at their job. They do a really good job at doing so. That's Biz. Like Biz, at this point, you have to don't take the bait from Biz. Biz is joking. He did it in a singular game when the Penguins were playing on TNT, where he went in the first intermission. He said, "You got to get Crosby off of this team. You got to get Crosby off this team." And then they come back and they win. He said, "Yeah, I'm still joking, right?" So don't take the bait from Biz, and certainly don't take the bait from the people that are actually believing what they're saying, because there is no chance in where that Sidney Crosby is going anywhere. Let's close off this episode with a listener question, something that we haven't done in a little while, but we got a really good one in the comment section last week, so I wanted to address it today, and it's a long one, so bear with me. We're going to break this down in stages. This is from Our Little Adventures on YouTube, who says, quote, "Say Dubas makes a major splash in free agency," and this is kind of connected to what we just talked about at the end of the last segment, "and gets Mitch Marner from the Toronto Maple Leafs. Our first line might be Rakell, Sid, and Marner. That would mean, if we don't trade him, Bryan Rust moves down to the second line, and that may look like Tomasino, Gino, and Rust. I'd say our top two lines would be looking extremely well." Now, there's a second part to this. If Rust gets traded, which we'll talk about, I actually hope, because he never plays over 60 games or so, Dubas may go after a guy like JJ Peterka via a trade. And a second line would then be Tomasino, Gino, and Peterka. That would be lights out too. Do you have any thoughts on these chances? And how do you feel about this scenario? Now, we're going to leave the trading Bryan Rust segment to the very end, but let's start with the chances it happens. Horwat, I've run the numbers in my heart, in my soul. And these are optimistic because, as you know, and as our listeners know, I am going to skew optimistic in almost every single conversation that we have. Mitch Marner alone, 10% chance. Like, that's being optimistic. That is the best odds you're going to get from any sports book, any writer, anybody that speaks about hockey. 10% chance Marner ends in Pittsburgh. Peterka alone, 20%, because he was already on the trade block and he was already talked about being somebody that would fit perfectly. As Elliot Friedman said, he has Pittsburgh written all over him. So optimistically, 20% on Peterka alone. Trading Bryan Rust, 20% chance. I'm not saying there's not a chance. The Penguins are in a rebuild. Things can happen, but I would still put that at 20% chance. Now, for all three to happen, and I'll let you tell me whether or not I'm off on my numbers or if I'm dead on. For all three of these to happen, for Marner to come to the Penguins, for Peterka to be traded to the Penguins, and for Bryan Rust to be traded out of Pittsburgh, I think all three, again, highest I'll go, 5% chance.
I think that is about average correct when you throw those percentages in there. I don't know math like that, but
I mean, the average is like 15 if you want to take them all out and average them, but I would say 5% that all three happen.
Yeah, the layering of it and the realisticness of it, absolutely down to about 5%. Boiling it down, let me go one by one here for a moment too. I'm with you on Marner being about 10. Just genuinely, what would he have to gain from coming here? It's a rebuilding situation. I get he would be a big boost to the idea of going for it again next year. Okay, but what about the years after? He becomes the centerpiece, and I get it's not an apples to apples comparison when it comes to being a centerpiece of a team from Toronto to Pittsburgh, but Pittsburgh can be kind of harsh. So I don't know if he'd want to continue that. Maybe he wants a quieter situation. I mean, like I said, not an apples to apples comparison, but you get what I'm going with.
Mm-hmm.
So what would he have to gain from that? Not much. I like your 10% there. I think Peterka's got a bit more than 20, at least. The connections were there already. The rumor mill was a buzz that Dubas and the Sabres were already in conversation about some scenarios. Don't know how far they got. Don't know who was involved, but that was kind of the baseline. And the way Elliot Friedman said, Peterka fits Pittsburgh very well. Who knows what kind of situation the Penguins are looking for this offseason. But I'd give you more than 20 on that. I'd push 30 to 40. Again, that's very generous, I know. Mm-hmm. But if the Sabres can bring the price down a touch, I forget what they were asking for a lot too. Not to the Rickard Rakell amount, but they were asking for quite a bit for Peterka. If they bring that down over the offseason a bit, because it's axe time in Buffalo, who knows who survives. Mm-hmm. And then as for Rust, I also want to go a little higher than 20, but not much. Just because, again, who knows what kind of situation the Penguins are in. Teams will be calling about Bryan Rust, there's no doubt. And if the price fits, much like the Rickard Rakell price, I'd say for Rust it's around there, if not maybe a little lower. Dubas have no choice but to pull the trigger almost. Who knows what that return could be? That could be the Peterka deal. Could be in that sort of vein. So I would say a trade for Bryan Rust is also a little higher than 20, but not much. 25 is about as high as I'd go there. So that's the way I see it. If you want to average that out, all three of those happenings, about 15%, the actual 15%. Very extremely unlikely, mostly because what does Mitch Marner have to gain from coming here?
Yeah, now the interesting thing here is if I was Buffalo, and again, this is an outsider's perspective, I don't watch every single game that happens at KeyBank Center and just with Buffalo, but Bryan Rust is exactly who I would want to bring in. Like, obviously, you'd need more in that trade for JJ Peterka, but they have a lot of young talent in that organization. I mean, that's without a guy like Konsta Helenius, who I believe they took last year, who was extremely talented. They have Zach Benson, who's extremely talented. They have Tage Thompson, who's a little bit older, but he's extremely talented. They need leaders. And Bryan Rust, if it wasn't for the fact that he is sitting behind three generational organizational pillars, he would have had a letter on his sweater for the last 8 years. But probably not in his first 3, but probably the last 8 years. He would have a letter on his sweater. And if Kris Letang goes anywhere, if Evgeni Malkin retires, he is leader in the clubhouse to get a letter on his sweater. He is a leader, and that's what Buffalo needs. They have all the young talent in the world. I mean, look no further than their defense. So if they're going to trade away JJ Peterka and try to kind of shift a little bit to try to fix the kind of the vibe around Buffalo, the fact that they don't have a winning culture, bringing in a guy like Bryan Rust seems like a pretty solid antidote. At the very least, it feels like it starts to push you in the right direction, which is good for Buffalo. But let's get back to this hypothetical and say if it did. So take out what are the chances it happens. We both said unlikely to actually occur. But if it did, let's go down to this hypothetical lane. It is a pretty good top 6. Rakell, Crosby, Marner as your top line. Peterka, Malkin, Tomasino as your second line. That's really good. And how would I feel? I'd feel extremely confident in the top 6, but I will say that's not enough on its own to change my opinion of this team being a playoff team next year, because you still need to restructure your defense. You still have many, many questions at goaltending, and the bottom 6, less question marks, because I think you could turn that over to a lot of your young guys that are tearing it up in Wilkes-Barre right now, and you could probably get better performance out of the bottom six. So I'm not as concerned. If this is your top six, then your bottom six can be filled out with guys like Koivunen, guys like McGroarty, guys like Tommy Novak, who has been injured since he got traded over. So I'm not as worried about the bottom six if this is your top two lines, but I'm still concerned about your defense and your goaltending because that can sink even the best offensive units.
Yeah, absolutely. And the money question would have to come up a little bit because Marner would request a ton of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
However, with the cap going up and the Penguins supposedly having a fair bit of room, it's less of a question. So, when you get to the bottom six and restructuring the defense, it's less of a question of who's paying for these players or who's making what money. But by all means, you're right. The top six is much improved. Questions would still, I think, would come up about Evgeni Malkin once the season started, just to kind of be realistic a bit in terms of, okay, how good really is Gino at this point? I get by namesake he starts on the second line, but who knows where it goes from there.
I think if you give him good wingers really quickly.
If
you give him a winger like JJ Peterka and let him build off of what he started with Phil Tomasino, I think you see a little bit more consistency. Now, do I think you see as high of a level as we've seen Gino in the past? No, you're not going to get him to that level at 39 years old. You just aren't. But I do think that you see a little bit more consistency because he's playing with a higher caliber of player.
Yeah, a bit more towards what Sid is doing in terms of he's old, but look at these numbers. They're still great. Speaking of the Buffalo thing, I do want to dig back to that in a minute. I was going to try and finish up my thoughts here. The big question is going to be defense and goaltending. The bottom six, you like you said, can fill out however you want. Even the top six, if it stays like this, is fine. You will need an improvement here or there. And who knows, maybe one of those call-ups does that. Who knows? The question will be restructuring that defense, especially if Erik Karlsson's one of those moves, and then figuring out goaltending. Suddenly Tristan Jarry is playing at the top on his head, on his skull. Is that going to continue? Probably not, but
I have a thought on that I will reserve judgment for until he continues to do this for a week or two.
Exactly. Well, those are questions that we can get back to. Those are going to be your big questions, though, is the back end of the ice, stopping the other team from scoring, because that has clearly been a big downfall of the Penguins this season. It's not an easy one to recuperate. It's not an easy one to rebuild. But Kyle Dubas, since last trade deadline, has been pretty solid, to say the least. And as for the Buffalo thing, don't forget Jason Zucker's up there. Yeah. Reuniting Bryan Rust and Jason Zucker. I saw those two interact in the locker room together in my first year covering the team with the Hockey News. An unbelievable friendship. Unbelievable, those two. So seeing those two reunited in Buffalo, I get it's Buffalo and you have the pressures of 16 straight seasons without a playoff appearance. But maybe that little bit of underestimation, maybe that little bit of revamping that they're going to have to do this summer. If it's Bryan Rust and Jason Zucker sharing a line with Tage Thompson, I'd be frightened. I get that's probably not how the line would work, but I'd be frightened. That's a heck of a line. All three of those men will run right through you and somehow find a way to score.
Yeah, no, I think that those two in a locker room, and you want to talk about changing the culture of the Buffalo Sabres, those two in a locker room could really spearhead something like that. I understand that they brought in Alex Tuch and that was supposed to help, but bringing in guys that have been there, done that the way that Zucker and more so Bryan Rust has, bringing over guys that have learned at the heels of a couple of the greatest leaders that we've seen in the sport, specifically and namely in Sidney Crosby. I think that would be great for the Buffalo Sabres locker room. But again, that's from us, people that are, 10,000 foot view of that locker room. Whenever you have all that talent, all that young talent, let's not forget all those years where they had Jack Eichel and a lot of other talented players around them. They haven't been able to get the job done. It starts to feel like it's more than just, we need more talent. It feels like it's a locker room thing. It feels like it's a culture thing. And that's why, a guy like Josh Yohe put out, be careful what you wish for when you're asking for them to tank, because sometimes it's hard to bring that winning culture back. Now, fortunately, Penguins have Sidney Crosby, which always makes it a little bit easier because he won't let the culture turn into let's just throw in the towel, because he never does. He's 37 years old. And like we said, he's leading the NHL in 5-on-5 scoring this year. But I think that's something that you look at Buffalo and it again, 10,000 foot view, it feels like something they might be missing. Now, let's get into this specifically. Should the Penguins consider trading Bryan Rust? He's going to be 33 next season. He has 3 years left on his current deal, $5.125 million left. All the clauses wiped out, so he can go anywhere. He doesn't have any more power in the situation when it comes to trade clauses. Should the Penguins consider trading him this summer?
I would think so. At least consider it. At least keep that option on the table. Treat it much like they did Rickard Rakell this past trade deadline. Set the price high, essentially make it be an offer that you cannot refuse. This isn't something you want to do necessarily, but you can almost see the writing on the wall. I mean, strike while the iron is hot, especially because this contract does run for another 3 seasons.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows if a 35-year-old Bryan Rust is going to be worth having around at $5.125 million. I get the caps going up each year that follows, but you just never know. And with the team trying to, quote-unquote, go for it again, now I know he's a key piece to that, it's impossible to tell if he's still able to put up 30-goal paces past this season, past next season, past the year after. I say you treat Bryan Rust this summer like you did Rickard Rakell at the deadline. Set the price high, not obscenely high, but if it's an offer you can't refuse, take it. Thank you for your work. Thank you for a pair of Stanley Cups that you were a huge portion of. And, you get the very fun video upon return. You're one of those players of your family forever. We'll never forget you, this, that, the other. And who knows, maybe the veteran deal if this team is really in the crapper 4 years down the line.
Now, Kyle Dubas has said on multiple occasions, this is not a tear it to the studs rebuild. Bryan Rust is a stud. Even if it was a tear it to the studs rebuild, I view Bryan Rust as a pillar right now. I think Sidney Crosby is the obvious one. You include guys like Evgeni Malkin, you include guys like Kris Letang simply because of who they are. But I think the two guys propping up the house right now the most, as far as when I'm looking at this rebuild, are Sidney Crosby and Bryan Rust. Yeah, Rickard Rakell is a very talented player, but I am more inclined to keep Bryan Rust around simply because of really his entire game. Rickard Rakell, there's a lot of people, and rightfully so, that are saying, can he do this again? Is this a one-off? I don't think it is, but I think the questioning is fair. With Bryan Rust, I think his play is much more sustainable as he gets older. Now, part of the question was, if Rust gets traded, and then, quote, this is one person's opinion, just our listener, I actually hope because he never plays over 60 games or so, I'll push back on that a little bit. If you look at the last 3 seasons, since Bryan Rust has turned 30 years old, he's missed 32 games, which means he has played in 87% of the games. It feels like he misses a lot of time because the time he misses causes him to miss on 30-goal seasons, causes him to miss on 60-point seasons. But he's played in 87% of the games. And let's also not forget, what has he always been available for? Playoffs. If I'm not mistaken, and I might be, just because I'm thinking off the top of my head, I don't remember Bryan Rust missing games. I don't remember Bryan Rust missing, and not only missing games, but fading into the back in a lot of these games. As you mentioned, he's a playoff performer. He's a guy who everybody talks about Jake Gensel, and they should, because he is the top tier playoff performer. Bryan Rust is right there with him. Maybe not to the level, but guess what? He's always extremely good. So that's pretty good availability for a guy over the age of 30. And he's also one of few players who I think their game easily transfers between Crosby and Malkin. How often have we said, well, you got to keep Rickard Rakell with Crosby because he plays fine with Malkin, but it's just not the same level. Bryan Rust's game doesn't change. You have to adapt a lot of players when they go from playing with Crosby to playing with Malkin. Rust can just play his game, and it meshes with those two. So because of that, I think that, yeah, if somebody's willing to dish out 2 firsts and a top prospect that's ready to go right now, yeah, you have to consider that. You have to make the move because it's organizational malpractice if you don't. But anything short of that, he's a foundational piece, especially for what you mentioned. If you're trying to be competitive before Crosby is gone, Rust is a more important part of that than even Evgeni Malkin at this point.
I agree with you on that for sure. Keep forgetting, Rust's contract does run past Crosby's extension.
By 1 year, I think.
Yeah, by a season. Still past. Like you said, he's definitely one of those pillar players. He's definitely one of those studs. sometimes just when a team is in this situation, the phone's going to be blowing up this summer. You just know it. There was already reports that it was blowing up sort of leading up to this past deadline. But the Penguins had no plans of that because of the trade clause intact.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if not next season, if not this upcoming offseason, maybe the season after you really have the conversation, because at that point it'll be another year on. Malkin's probably out the door. Carlson's probably already gone. Who knows what the Letang situation looks like at that point. Then you really do consider the idea of, all right, yeah, it's not a tear down to the studs again, but you're looking to recoup a hockey trade out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Rust out for Peterka in, something like that. It's that sort of situation where, yeah, we're going to trade away a great player. We're going to get one back because we're continuing to build for what would be then at that point Crosby's final season, or at least of that current contract.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is a conversation we'll probably have again next summer whenever they inevitably don't trade him.
Yeah.
But it's always something to keep an eye on. I do think you just set the price high and you got to hear it out. This team is in no position to say players outside of Crosby, Malkin, Letang are off limits.
Now,
actually, Crosby, Malkin.
I was going to say, now, if you made your list right now of untouchables and ranking them, Crosby's clearly number one. Nobody's going to argue that fact. Who's 2, 3, and 4 right now? Because the way I see it, it is Malkin at number 2. Not because of his play as much as because of who he is, and he only has 1 year left. So why would you trade him at this point? Theoretically, has 1 year left. He can shock the world and say, I want to play at age 40. But again, a lot of expectation, a lot of speculation is that next year will be his last. Then I put Rust. I've been watching and I've been thinking, and I don't want to say anything until I have a lot of a sample size and I have my thoughts thoroughly laid out, because you don't call out one of the big three unless you have everything, I's dotted, T's crossed. But Kris Letang to me is less of a priority now than Bryan Rust is. So I still high, but I'd put Crosby, Malkin, Rust, then Letang.
Okay. I think Letang is still my 3. But there's a dotted line under 2. There's a dotted line of, at this point, anyone can go for the right price.
Is it the Moneyball thing where it's Crosby, Malkin, 50 feet of crap, and then there's us?
No, it's
maybe
just,
not 50 feet of crap, but 50 feet of separation.
It's not even that. It is just it goes untouchable, and then just the dotted line of from here down, essentially for the right price, anyone can be had. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that third spot goes to Letang still, if nothing else, for the sake of storytelling and for the sake of narratives around the team and just the history those 3 are making. It could be bad. I think it could be a bad situation. And if those 3 are still around, you at least still have a story to tell each and every game, each and every start of a season, which there would be a few many more. But you get what I'm going for, another year of the same trio on the same team, another year of the same trio doing this. They're surpassing these records, that record, to the point of we had this discussion a long time ago, to the point of, do they get their numbers retired at the same time? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think that's what makes Letang the 3 and then Rust the 4. That's sort of my hierarchy there. And then Rakell as a 5, and then it's the solid lineup. Anyone under here can be sent out the door tomorrow.
Yeah.
And that's sort of how I see it.
I might be a cynic, but I think the story's over. I think the story's over with the big 3. I really do. I think keeping them longer for the sake of keeping them together is no longer viable. I think obviously both Malkin and Letang's games have noticeably dipped, but I think one of them has 3 years left on his contract and plays a very high leverage role for your team and still has some more value. Now, Malkin would have value if he was on the market, but again, the timeline is very short when it comes to Evgeni Malkin's playing career. But I still put him 4 again. I'm not coming out here saying trade Kris Letang right effing now. I'm not pulling a Denny Lemieux, but at the same time, I look at that and I'm saying, I'm not keeping him for the sake of a storyline. If there's a chance to pull a parachute, I'm seriously considering pulling the parachute, because they already have the record for the longest tenured trio in North American sports history. They beat, I think it was Posada, Rivera, and Jeter of the Yankees. Nobody's catching that. Nobody's catching that anymore. It's already unheard of that the Penguins trio has done that in today's day and age. Nobody's going to catch that. No trio is going to stay on the same team for 20 years anymore. That's just not how sports work. across all athletics. So I think that the story has been written. Now you're just adding chapters, but they're not juicy chapters. It's the point of the book where you're like, this is just repeating what we've seen for the last 3 chapters. I think the book is over. I don't think you need to finish. I don't think you need to get to the credits of this movie. So again, I might be a little bit too harsh, but at the same time, if it comes to a point where it's like, okay, he's not playing well, and it would be better for the defense if we moved him and brought something back of leverage and cleared up that space, I wouldn't be closed off to doing so. So that's just my opinion. Unless you have anything else on it, I think I'll wrap.
No, I get that too, because like I said, that's why it's the dotted line for me. It is, I only have the 2 for sures. Kris Letang can be had at the right price. You're right. The story is essentially over. But just the longevity of it, the more solidifying of the story, just as that sort of view of it is something that fans will never want to see end as well. It's one of those sort of situations.
Now, with that said, I would love to be wrong. I would love for them to pull out a 2019 Tiger Woods at Augusta and just do it in spite of everybody saying that they couldn't. But from where I sit today, it feels like the story is close to, if not already over, when it comes to those 3 and what they can do as a trio together in the National Hockey League.
They need to finish the story in a completely different fashion.
Yes, exactly. But that's going to do it for this episode of The Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this one. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Make sure that you like, share, subscribe if you enjoy our content, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. See you guys next time.